I want to welcome everybody to today's MPUG Global Web and Learn. Today we'll be talking about some tips and tricks and best practices for using Microsoft Project. We're glad to have Ira Brown back with us today to talk about some tips and tricks.
For those of you that may not be familiar with the baseline features in Project, the concept behind saving a baseline in Microsoft Project is we want to be able to take a snapshot of what our project looks like at the point in time prior to beginning the execution of our project. So at that point in time is when you actually want to set the baseline information in your project, which captures this special kind of snapshot so that we have a permanent record in our project of what the start dates look like at that point in time. What often happens, though, is when you set the baseline in your project, new tasks get added as you start to discover some additional things that need to happen that weren't known at the time you created your project and therefore set your first baseline. So what we sometimes might want to be able to do is recapture or save our baseline, but only for those tasks that have not yet been baselined. We don't want to overwrite it. We only want to set the baseline for some new tasks that have been added. And we want to make that easier with our macro. So let me show you how that would be done. And this, again, is going to be just based upon the Microsoft Solution Framework project. It's one of the templates that comes with Microsoft Project. And I've inserted this column here called Baseline Start. So notice that none of the tasks have a baseline yet. We can just tell that by looking at the Baseline Start field. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set an initial baseline for this project. So the way we go about doing that, in Project 2010, we click on the Project tab, select Set Baseline, and we'll say Set Baseline for entire project. And notice, by the way, while we're here, that you can actually take these additional baseline snapshots at various points throughout the life of your project. Notice you have up to 10 additional baselines beyond just the original set of baseline fields that come with project. And this particular option here is going to be real important in a moment, where we're going to want to be able to go back in and set the baseline just for selected tasks, which will be those tasks that we have newly added to the project. But initially here, let me set the baseline for the entire project. Click OK. Okay, so now every task in the project has a baseline. And what I would like to do now is I'd like to add a couple of additional tasks to this project. So right here, I'm going to insert a task, and these are going to be a couple of training-related tasks. So I'm going to add a task here called Perform Core Team Training. Okay, and we'll just make it a 2-day task. And then further on down in the project, right as we get into our testing, I want to be able to deliver some training to the expanded team as well. So I'm going to put a task here called Perform Training for Test Team. And we'll also make that a 2-day task. But notice for those two new tasks there, the baseline start says NA. Right, because we haven't yet saved the baseline for those new tasks. So when you're thinking about automating something in Microsoft Project, what you want to think about is how would you accomplish the thing that you're trying to automate in a manual fashion. You're not going to be able to automate something in Microsoft Project unless you would actually know how to do it manually. So that's the key. And then when you go and do it manually, as you're doing it, we'll record the macro. And then at that point, we'll have some good macro code that we can then use to run for future new tasks to get added to this project. So how do we go about turning on our macro recorder? The way we do that is we click on the View tab, and off to the right we have a button here that says Macros, and we'll just select Record Macro. Now, if you're using earlier versions of Microsoft Project, you would be able to accomplish the same thing, but from the Tools menu, you select Tools, Macro, Record New Macro. Okay, and I'm going to give this macro a name, and so let's call this something like set baseline new tasks. Okay, notice when you type in your macro name, you don't want to put any spaces in there, and typically you would want to capitalize each word just to make it a little easier to read. Okay, and I'll go ahead and click OK. And our macro recorder is now on. So anything that we do from this point forward in project is actually being recorded in the macro. Okay, so let's go back to what I said previously. How would you do this manually then if you wanted to be able to set the baseline for only those tasks that have not yet been baseline? Well, we ought to be able to accomplish that by creating a filter in project, because that's exactly what a filter does. A filter says only show me those tasks that meet a particular criteria. And in this case, the criteria can be where the baseline start equals NA. If we see the baseline starts equal to NA, that's a pretty safe bet that that task has not yet been baselined. Okay? So, again, as our macro recorder is running here, let's create a new filter. So we'll go to the filter dropdown, and I will say new filter, and let's call this filter tasks not yet baseline. And when you're naming a filter, you can put spaces in. That's perfectly fine. Okay, so the logic here is only show those tasks where the field called baseline start, which is right here, equals NA. And now we'll click apply. So notice that when we apply our filter, we're seeing the two new tasks that we just created. And that's exactly what I want, because I only want to be able to set the baseline for those tasks. So now that we've filtered out all the other tasks, let me go ahead and select those tasks. And a convenient way to do that is just to click on the corner button here, which is the Select All button. And now I'll go back to my Set Baseline feature. I'll say Project, Set Baseline. But this time, rather than saying Set Baseline for the entire project, I'm going to say Set Baseline only for selected tasks. Click OK. And it's giving me this little warning message that we've already set the baseline once. Do you want to overwrite? In this case, we're really not going to be overwriting because we're only going to be setting the baseline for the two new tasks. So I'll say yes. Okay, so notice that the baseline start is now populated. And the final thing that I want to do is I don't want to leave my project with this filter applied. So let me go back to the View tab here, and let me reapply the No filter, or in earlier versions of project, it would just be called the All Tasks filter. All right, so that's really all we needed to do. We've just created our macro, and hopefully in the course of doing everything there, we got all recorded. So now I go back to the macro button, and I will say stop recording. And we now have a macro that we can use. So before we actually run this macro to see if it worked, let's take a quick look at it. I'm going to go to the macro button. I'm going to say View Macros. And there's our Set Baseline New Task macro that we created. And I'm just going to say Edit. Eventually I could actually run it from here, but I'm just going to click the Edit button. And there's our macro. So this is actually generated using what's called Visual Basic for Applications, or VBA. And let me just break this down for you here, and you see exactly what it did. This first line here, this filter edit line, that's the line of code. That one line there is what created our filter with all those different settings, like the name of the filter and the field name, baseline start.
Hey, Ira, we had a quick question from someone who was asking why you wouldn't create that filter before you created the macro.
Yep. That's a great question. Why would you not simply run the filter? Why are we creating the filter as part of the macro? Well, the reason for that is because you can imagine that if you tried to run this macro, what would happen if that filter, for whatever reason, did not exist in your environment? What if somebody deleted that filter? Or what if for whatever reason, someone renamed that filter, and all kinds of things can happen, right? So if it goes to try to apply the filter, but the filter doesn't exist, you're going to get an error message when you run the macro. So what I like to do, especially when you're working in a standalone copy of Microsoft Project, is we can actually create the filter as part of the automation. And it really, the amount of time it adds to run the code is in nanoseconds. So this way you're ensuring that those particular things that you're relying on being there when you run your macro are there. Now, if you're running in a project server environment and you can create enterprise filters or enterprise tables and views, then users really can't delete those. So in that case, you probably would be okay just applying that rather than creating it as part of the macro. Okay? So I hope that answered your question there. So this first line, again, is where we created the filter. This next line applies the filter, filter apply. You remember we selected the corner button to select all the tasks? That's what that line there that says select sheet. This next line here is where we actually saved our baseline. Notice it says all equals false. What that means is not all tasks, just the selected tasks. And then finally, when we're finished, filter apply. And this reapplies the all tasks filter. Okay? So that looks pretty good. So the one thing I want to then do, just to make it easier for my users to be able to run this filter, is rather than having them go to the macros button and then bring up the macros dialog box, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to add it to my ribbon at the top of the screen. So that way we just give the person a button to click on, and it makes it much easier for people to access these custom macros that you create. So how do we do that? Well, I'm going to right mouse click in the ribbon area, and I'm going to select Customize the Ribbon. Okay? So on the right side of the screen, these are all the various tabs that we have on our existing ribbon. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on the end there, and I'm going to click New Tab. All right, so notice when I did that, it put a new tab right here. And rather than just having it say New Tab, we're going to try to make that a little nicer. So we'll right mouse click, and I'm going to click Rename, and I'm going to call this MPUG. All right, so now our new tab that we created will have the name MPUG. And then where it says New Group, I'm going to rename that as well, and I'm going to call that MPUG Macros. Okay, so now what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to take our macro and I want to include it right in that MPUG Macros group that we created. So the way I do that is on the left side of the screen where it says Choose Commands From, we're going to select Macros from that list. And there's our Set Baseline New Tasks. I'm going to click Add. And I'm also going to give it a friendlier name here. So I'll rename it. And I will say Set Baseline for New Tasks. I can put the spaces back in. And I can also give it a whatever icon I would like. I'll pick that one right there. Click OK. And then we click OK on the ribbon dialog. And notice at the top of our screen, we now have an MPUG tab. And when I click it, there's our set baseline for new tasks under the group called MPUG Macros. All right? So let's test this now to see if it worked. Let me insert a couple of new tasks here. I'll just call this New Task A and New Task B. Or 1 and 2 is also fine as well. Okay. So notice that those tasks do not yet have a baseline start. So if this macro worked correctly, if I run it, we should see those gates populated. So let's go ahead and click the button. And what do you know? Look at that. We now have the baseline start populated for Task 1 and Task 2, and we accomplished that without changing the baseline for any of the other tasks.